Welcome to the highlights of the seventh game of the World Chess Championship match between the reigning world champion Ding Liren from China and Domaraju Gukesh from India. It's a best of 14 game match, and at this stage, after 6 games, both the players have 3 points each. So the match is evenly poised, and the seventh game, this game will mark that the match is entering halfway stage and Gukesh is playing with white pieces. He started with knight f3. This is a minor surprise given that on the past 3 occasions with white pieces, Gukesh had played e4 twice and d4 once. So he started with knight f3. Ding played d5, Gukesh played g3, and Ding Liren, the world champion, he played g6. Well, this move looks slightly strange at first sight because the usual move here is to play knight f6. Usually, the players they conceal their intentions, whether black would want to develop his bishop from this diagonal or fianchetto. But one of the reasons why g6 was played by Ding is that after g6, if white continues with the usual plan of fianchettoing and castling, black has the option of playing e5 at once. So this is one of the advantages of delaying knight f6. The bishop on g7 supports the e5 pawn. Okay, so after g6, white preempted black's idea with d4, and black played bishop g7, white went c4. We have transposed the game into Grunfeld defense, which arises after the move orders d4, knight f6, c4, c4, g6, followed by d5. So this is the Grunfeld defense, which is very popular at top level. And many of the chess legends like Kasparov, Bobby Fischer, they have played Grunfeld defense from time to time. So it's also worth noting that if black doesn't play d5 and continues with bishop g7 or d6 instead, that is also another popular defense, which is named the King's Indian defense. So both King's Indian and Grunfeld defenses are considered to be very theoretical, sharp, and counter-attacking defense for black. So here, after g6, d4, and c4, we have a position which transposed to the Grunfeld defense. Well, in the Grunfeld defense, white has many options, but here white has transposed to an option which arises in the fianchetto variation against the Grunfeld. Well, black played c6. This is not the only defense. Usually, black would play knight f6 and then later decide whether to play c6 or take dc and create counterplay against the center. c6 is basically a hybrid of, or you can say, two ideas, two defenses, one Slav defense and Grunfeld defense. Both the defenses ideas are borrowed. And usually in the Grunfeld, the pawn belongs to c5, not on c6. But against the fianchetto system, this is one of the reliable ways to defend. Okay, white played bishop g2 and black played knight f6. Both players castled. Well, previously, in the World Championship match between Karpov and Kasparov, remember the two Soviet players who were the strongest players of the world, and they played many World Championship matches among themselves. So there, Karpov as white had repeatedly tried this fianchetto variation, and black had employed c6. And in this position, white used to play cd5, cd5, knight c3, well, reaching a symmetrical position where all the pawns and pieces are arranged in a similar manner. And black usually played knight e4 to break the symmetry and create an imbalance. So those were the games played between Karpov and Kasparov in previous World Championship matches. But here, in this position, Gukesh played a move which is very surprising. That is rook to e1. Well, one of the purpose behind this move is that with c6, one of black's intentions is to capture on c4 and to support the pawn, the c4 pawn, with moves like b5. The c6 pawn supports the b5 pawn as well as, well, closes this diagonal. So this may be one of black's intention. With rook e1, white actually prepares to face dc with e4, the e4 pawn supported by the rook. Having said that, personally, I don't trust the move. I don't believe the move rook e1 is a good move. Okay, although it has been played by one of the strongest players of the world, I think he has played more to surprise his opponent than because of the merit of the move. And the reason why I feel rook e1 is not a good move is that firstly, it doesn't really threaten anything. And if black simply continues to develop, rook on e1 looks silly if white cannot manage to play e4. And secondly, just to show you that this is exactly the same position after rook e1 with black to play, but usually this position arises from a related opening where it is white to play. And even with white to play, white struggles to prove he has any advantage. So usually games are equal. With black to play, definitely white should not have any advantage objectively from this position. So let us check why I am not so optimistic about the move rook e1 at this point. Remember, it is black to play in this particular position. So let's go back to the initial moves. d4, knight f6. If white plays knight f3, and if the game starts with d4, and if the game continues like this, and black doesn't play the Grunfeld, rather he plays the King's Indian with d6. One of the sidelines for white is rook e1 with the intention of advancing e4. Okay, the main move obviously is to go c4, but if white plays rook e1, now black has many defenses, but there have been games even by grandmasters where black plays d5. He says, okay, I will lose one move, but what is your move rook e1 achieving? So this is a move which is a waste of time for you. So black loses one move and achieves this position. After which white plays c4, c6, and we have the same position which has arisen in the game with white to play. And many grandmasters are willing to play this with black pieces, and they have a perfectly equal position. So with black to play, definitely white doesn't have advantage, and Gukesh has played the rook e1 move, which I don't believe is the best. But this has surprise value because Gukesh was, Ding was definitely not expecting this. Here, DC is a critical move. One of the ideas, as I said, is if black plays DC, white will find the usefulness of rook e1 by playing e4. But if black doesn't play DC, and if he continues his development with moves like, say, bishop f5, then rook e1 doesn't look that much useful. But now Ding went for a long thought. He thought for 28 minutes. He fell behind on clock, and this is exactly Gukesh's strategy, to play surprising moves and let Ding be under time pressure. So Ding thought for a long time and he decided to play DC anyway. So he says that I will accept your pawn sacrifice. The move c6 has basically prepared to support the pawn, and so he played DC. After white played e4, black went bishop g4 first. He's developing his pieces, and basically this is a temporary pawn sacrifice for white. White gives up his c pawn, but he occupies the center, and well, his pieces are more active, and he's hoping that this pawn will create some attacking chances in future. So let's see whether white succeeds. Black played knight bishop g4, and white played knight bd2, developing his knight. Well, there is some point behind the move knight c3, which is a more normal move. White can have an idea of advancing d5 or e5 in future, but well, black has a completely satisfactory position. He will play knight a6, and basically the d4 pawn will also be under some pressure in most of the lines. If white attacks the bishop, black will exchange the bishop, and he can also, in this position, strike back in the center by playing e5. For example, if white takes d5, black can recover the pawn. He can play knight d7, knight e5. Remember, the pawns are equal at this stage. And if black manages to get knight e5, he will be a pawn up again. And these knights would get very good outposts on d3. So this could have been black's idea had he played, okay, had white started with knight c3. So to preempt any such ideas, white played knight bd2. And at this point, we feel Ding Liren made the first mistake of the game. He had already thought for 28 minutes while capturing on c4, and now he took another 5 minutes to play c5. He changed his plan, he altered his plan, and instead of going b5, he played c5. Okay, probably Ding was skeptical, or he was not sure how much Gukesh had prepared at home. So he did not play the critical move, fearing that he may fall under some opening preparation and white may punish him. I mean, he may not play Gukesh, but he may play some modern engines which the players use while preparing for openings. Well, he played c5, which I feel is a mistake. He should have played b5. If he wanted to avoid critical moves and avoid opening preparation of Gukesh, he should not have played dc4 at all. So having decided to play the critical variation, he changes his mind and played the move c5 instead. Okay, here white played d5 and black went e6. So white gets central pawns which are advancing and black is temporarily a pawn up. Here in calculation, Ding Liren missed that white can actually play h3, which Gukesh played. After bishop f3, white can recapture with the bishop. Ding thought that he's simply winning a pawn by playing knight d5, and he will be 2 pawns up at this stage. But after reaching bishop f3, he realized that he cannot capture the second pawn because white will then play knight c4, recovering 1 pawn, and now this knight is pinned because if it moves, white can capture on b7 and win the exchange. If black plays bishop d4, which was probably Ding's previous calculation, bishop h6 wins the exchange on the spot because now white is threatening the f8 rook. The bishop can't go back because that will leave this knight unprotected. And if black plays rook e8 over here after bishop h6, then white can once again deflect the queen from defense of the knight and capture the knight. He will be a piece up. So this is what Ding missed. And after ed, he did not capture on d5, but he preferred to complete his development by knight bd7. White recovered his pawn. So at this stage, after the completion of the initial moves, we can assess or evaluate the position as slightly better for white. White has 2 bishops. White has especially the f3 bishop, the light square bishop, which black doesn't have. And white also has a passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn which doesn't have any opposition or opposing pawns in front of it. That means there is no pawn which can prevent it from advancing. So if black had a pawn on c7 or e7, this would not be a passed pawn. Since black's pawn is already on c5, this pawn doesn't have any opposition to stop it from advancing. So with absence of pawns, the only way how black can prevent this pawn from advancing is by placing the pieces in front of this pawn. And we call it blockading the passed pawn. So how does black blockade? Typically, he has a knight on d7. It will be even better if he can get his knight on d6, preventing the pawn from advancing. If he can manage to put his knight on d6, that knight would prevent the pawn from advancing and activating this bishop. So we can assume that if black has a safe knight on d6, his knight would be better placed than this bishop, and black would have some advantage. But that is not possible at this point. So this bishop, it seems, is more important than the knight, and the passed pawn is actually quite useful, not only for promotion but also for attack, as we shall see. Well, here black played b5. So one of the compensation which black has in return for the passed pawn is he has a majority on the queen side. He has 3 pawns against white's 2. So he played b5 attacking the knight. The knight went to a3 and black played queen b6. So on black's part, he argues that this knight on a3 is actually on the edge of the board, and that gives white an extra piece on the other half of the board to operate. And also black has a majority on the queen side. White played bishop f4, black went rook e8. So both the players are completing their development. White played queen d2, connecting the rooks, and black played rook a d8. So we can assume that black has completed his development or mobilization, and he is prepared to play against the d5 pawn, which is white's passed pawn. But also the pawn doesn't have any support, so it is an isolated pawn as well. Now here, this is a position where Gukesh played a brilliant move, and that is he went knight to c2. This move, well, regroups or repositions his knight from the edge of the board to the center on the king side where the fight will be. Besides, he's preparing for the next move, which is even better. Now, black played a move which was criticized by almost all the commentators and which is not a good move. That is knight f8. Well, black's idea was to go knight e6, relying on the pin against the queen, and maybe to go knight d4 if given chance, but he doesn't get opportunity to play knight e6. And the knight on f8 remains a passive knight. Well, white played the brilliant move and one of the ideas behind knight c2, that is b4. What is the purpose behind this move? Well, at this point, black controls all these squares right from a4 with his c and b pawns. He doesn't allow white's pieces to approach these squares. Now with b4, basically white breaks the chain and he secures the d4 square for his pieces. And if white can place one of his pieces on d4 squares, well, for example, if black advances or takes, white can play knight d4 at some point and he can reach the outpost c6, which is undefended. So that is why b4 move is such a nice move. It basically, whether black captures or advances, white secures d4 square for his pieces. Well, in this position, white thought for 19 minutes before playing this move, and black also took about 15 minutes before playing c4. He could have opted for cb as well. White would have played knight b4. Now the knight is approaching c6 square, which is a great square for white, supported by this pawn. And black could have played knight e4, which was tempting, attacking the queen and attacking the rook with his bishop. If white plays bishop e4, black will actually capture the rook. And if white captures the bishop, black will also capture this bishop, and black will be an exchanger. So this was one of the options which black had. Of course, white had better moves here. After knight e4, bishop e4, bishop a1, white would have played knight c6 with an excellent position. Well, this is the reason why Gukesh had consumed 19 minutes before playing b4. He got convinced that this position is actually good for him. And Ding took 15 minutes before deciding that he will play c4 and not cb. So Ding played c4. He also created his own passed pawn. The difference being that black's pawn is supported by his colleague and white's pawn is isolated. So that way, black has a better passed pawn, but white has a central passed pawn. So that gives white an added advantage, and white has two bishops. White played bishop e3 attacking the queen. When the queen moved to a6, well, maybe black could have considered queen b8 to keep the queen more in touch with the important squares. But queen a6 looks little sidelined. The queen is on the edge of the board. Here, white played bishop d4, and this is an excellent move, neutralizing the strong bishop on g7. Well, now from this point onwards, Gukesh started dominating the play, and Ding's position sharply declined. I mean, he was under time pressure. He had consumed a lot of time by thinking over the small decisions. And now he took rook e1. He took 7 minutes for this move. After white recaptured rook e1, he decided to accept the pawn sacrifice. Well, while playing bishop d4, white was actually offering this pawn. After queen a2, white went rook a1, seizing the a file, and he can capture the a pawn, or he can go for the b pawn as well. Here, black played queen to b3. He had an option of playing c3, vacating the c4 square for his queen. But after bishop c3, rook a2 would be met by, obviously, cd2, and black is perfectly fine. After bishop c3, black would go queen c4. So it seems black is doing quite fine, but white has the only move. He has to find bishop f6 and rook a7. And this position is, well, white continues to have an extra pawn. Although we have opposite colored bishop, white has some winning chances or some advantage from this position. Well, it has to be noted that if white played bishop d4 instead of bishop f6, black could actually capture the d5 pawn. He could retake the d5 pawn, and white cannot win because of this pin. He can try bg7, king g7, rook d1. This knight is pinned, but see, if the knight moves anywhere, white will capture the d8 rook. But black can play rook c8, moving the rook out of pin, and he can counterattack on c2. So that way, black can save his game. But of course, white has a simpler solution. He can take on f6, and he can take on a7. He will be a pawn up. Well, in this position, black decided to play simply queen b3, moving his queen away from attack, and white played rook a3, attacking the queen. The queen went to b1 check. White went to g2. Now, white is a pawn down, but black's queen is totally on the edge of the board, and his pieces are totally uncoordinated. White has a very active rook. This extra a pawn doesn't count at this point at all. And as we shall see, that white finds a very nice plan to put pressure upon black's position. Black played rook d7 to prevent rook a7. Well, white could capture the a7 with his bishop, but he went for even better move. That is, he played rook a5, attacking the b pawn. Once the b pawn falls, the c pawn is also likely to fall, and well, the c pawn would lose its protection, basically. Now here black played queen b3, and white could have captured b3, but he decided to repeat the position once. Well, this is probably a slightly questionable decision because white was having advantage at this point and black was down on clock. So by repeating moves, basically you allow your opponent to make more number of moves. So he had to make 40 moves to reach the time control. And Gukesh, black doesn't have to force to think. When he played rook a1, immediately black went queen b1, and rook a5, again the queen went to b3. So black played two moves without thinking, which helped black to reach his time control. And finally, white went rook b5. Now black kept on finding the only moves. Over here, black was actually playing quite good in time pressure. Many commentators thought that maybe black will collapse from this point because, well, after queen d3, black is offering to exchange queens, and white went queen f4. Uh, well, bishop e3 was a simpler solution. White has a passed pawn, he has a strong rook, and this position should be a big advantage to white. But instead, white went queen f4. He avoided the exchange. He counterattacked on f6. He allowed black to capture on c2. White took on f6. And here black played a very interesting resource defensive move, that is queen to f5. Well, if we look at the position, one of the reasons why white has advantage is that this knight on f8 doesn't have a single good square. The only square it can have is it can go to d7, but first he has to move his rook. And this pawn can advance without any major hurdles. And when white advances this d pawn, basically he will activate his bishop. So that is white's the reason for why white has advantage. That is why black played queen f5. This is a very useful move for white, for black, because he's offering to exchange on f5. Black has double pawns. Later it was found that white had a simpler solution. He did not exchange at this point. He could play bishop g5 instead, protecting his bishop. And, well, if black exchanges, this bishop is quite well placed. Both the bishops are well placed to advance the pawns. So this is how white could have played or should have played. But instead, white exchanged the queens, and he thought that, well, the double pawns and a strong pawn on d5 would give white advantage. He took on g7, which is actually a very questionable decision. Gukesh should have played bishop g5 at this point. So it is roughly from this point, Gukesh started to lose thread of the game. He had played excellently till this point, but here, by exchanging the bishops, he made black's defensive task easier. The king got activated, and moreover, the two bishops in tandem could have controlled lots of squares, which would have enabled the pawn to advance. But now we see why Ding offered to exchange the queens on f5, and he voluntarily took these double pawns. The reason is that the knight from f8 suddenly has got an excellent square on g6. Till the pawn was on g6, the knight couldn't have come here. But now look at the knight dance. The reason why black was having disadvantage is the same reason why black will be able to save the game from this point. So white simply captured the weak pawn, but black's knight jumped into action. White took rook c4, black played knight e5. White is a pawn up. He has a passed pawn, but the knight is active. Black is threatening to capture, he's obviously threatening c4, but if the rook moves, he will capture on f3 and then capture on d5. So white had to play rook d4 to place his rook behind his passed pawn. Now black played another amazing move. By the way, he could have played this move as well, defending the pawn, but that would allow black to play knight d3, attacking the rook, And if the rook goes to a5 or b5, the next move black is going to play is knight e1 check, winning the bishop. So that would have actually taken the game away from white. So this knight suddenly from f8 has started creating nuisance for white. Now after rook d4, this knight went to c6, taking advantage of the pin. And now the b4 pawn is also under attack. Here Gukesh played rook to f4. But the best move for white is, he is a pawn up currently. He should have given back the pawn by playing rook to d2 or rook d1. Well, when black captures this pawn, white could have advanced his pawn. And the reason is, now the bishop will regroup and this pawn will become very strong pawn. So instead of holding this pawn by rook f4, which Gukesh did, he should have given back the pawn, and d6 is much more powerful than a7 pawn. If black king approaches the pawn, white will play bishop e2, and against king e6, he would play bishop c4 check. So he will not allow the king to remain close to the pawn. King e5 doesn't work because white will play f4 check. So that way, black king cannot remain close to the pawn, and white can have a safe position. With bishop b5, he can advance on d7, and then he can put his rook on e8 or c8 with the help of d7 pawn. So that would have been big advantage for white, which Gukesh left at this point. He played rook f4. Black defended the pawn with his knight. So this knight played consecutive moves, g6, e5, c6, and now e7. White played b5, black went king f6, protecting the f pawn so that he can now move his knight once again. And after rook d4, for 2 moves, black missed a very instructive defense. We call this type of defense fortress, where although black is a pawn down, if he manages to get his knight on d6 by playing knight c8 and knight d6, in this position, white will not be able to find a single weakness or a point of attack. Now the bishop on f3 is blocked by his own pawns, and he doesn't have a single target where he can attack or he can advance his passed pawn. Why black can keep on waiting, and the game would most likely end in a draw. So this was a brilliant defense which black had. Unfortunately, he played h6, which doesn't spoil the position. But after king f1, he went king e5, and suddenly, once again, white has a big advantage, because this h6 pawn would be lost. Now, if black defended this pawn, the knight would not be able to reach d6, and white can play rook a4 attacking this pawn. And then if black keeps on defending, then white would play rook a6, and suddenly the rook would be very active and black would be defenseless. So, after rook h4, black decided to capture the passed pawn, and white took on h6. White is still 1 pawn up, and we have a new passed pawn on h3. So this is how white has a big advantage as a pawn up. He has a passed pawn. He has a bishop against knight. Now the only reason why black can keep on fighting is that he has an active king, and the knight still has some tricks left. So he played knight c3 attacking the pawn. And now white played a very nice move, that is rook c6 attacking the knight instead of defending the pawn. Because if black captures on b5, white can go rook c5, checking and winning the knight. So here black went knight e4. And at this point, the next couple of moves were slight inaccuracies by white. White always has the option of exchanging this knight for his bishop. But before playing such move, he has to be sure of the outcome of rook endgame, because although white is a pawn up, rook endgames are notorious for drawish tendencies. So bishop e4, f e4, rook c5 check was the move which white had to spot. After king e6, a move like g4, preventing black's f5 and basically creating a strong outpost for the rook on f5. Now both the pawns are separated, and this would have create an excellent winning chances for white. White is actually winning in this position. The king can gradually come up either from g2 or e2, and later he can advance his passed pawn. So a sample line, which is not forced, but just to show you how the game could go from this type of positions. Rook d1, the king would go to g2. Well, if it goes to e2, probably black can capture the h pawn with rook h1. King g2. If black plays rook d2 with the intention of playing e3 and creating counterplay, white has to play very well here. He can play rook check. Now, if king goes to e7, white would once again check. Basically, the purpose behind rook checks is white is positioning his rook in such a manner that, well, first he will play king g3 in such a manner that he can win tempo later, as we shall see. King g3 preventing e3. After rook d3 check, white can actually give up his pawn, and we can have a position where, well, the white's king is too active. It can support the b pawn and promote. This is not a forced variation, but a probable variation which can happen. If black goes king d6, for instance, in the variation which I analyzed just now, white can play a very nice sequence. That is, he can play rook a3, attacking this pawn. Now, against a move like rook f2, if he goes this, white can simply play rook e3, king f3, and win this pawn. Therefore, black will play rook f2, and white can go king g3, attacking this pawn. The pawn can't advance because the f2 rook is unprotected. And upon rook b2, we can have a position where, well, basically it's very difficult for black to, if he goes further away, then after exchange of these pawns, white will have an extra pawn and black's king is too far to defend. If the king goes to e5, then white can capture this pawn with a check, and he can play rook f3, attacking the pawn, and put his rook on f5. He will be 2 pawns up. So these are sample variations to show that instead of king e1, bishop e4 was an instant win, but white had to see the sequence rook c5 and g4. Instead, Gukesh played slight shaky moves in this situation. He played king e1, black played f6, and he advanced his h pawn. And suddenly black got counterplay after rook d3. The reason is that, well, black is attacking the bishop. He can still go bishop e4. But if he plans to preserve his bishop by playing bishop e2, then white can go rook b3, and he's threatening rook b1 check. And also, in some positions, he can capture the b5 pawn if the bishop covers. So this will create some counterplay for black. White played bishop d1. And in this position, Ding played the best move of the game from black side. That is, he played f4, which is a brilliant move. Well, the reason why f4 is brilliant is that the most natural response, bishop c2, is met by fg. It's a rook sacrifice. If white captures the rook, black will go g2. And suddenly, despite being a rook up, white is unable to prevent promotion. If he goes f4 check, the king is unable to come to f2 because of the placement of knight. So that was a trap which black had prepared against rook bishop c2. And of course, this move, black can take back on g3 and the game will be drawn. White played gf4 first. Actually, white had seen this move, but white's initial idea was to go rook c4. And it seems white is winning because white has double attack, double threats. The threat of f3, winning the pinned knight, and the threat of rook e4 followed by bishop c2, liquidating to king pawn endgame with extra pawn for white. That is also winning for white. So rook c4 basically threatens rook e4 and threatens f3. But the move which Gukesh had missed in his calculation is rook h3. Brilliant move which saves black. Because after f3, now of course rook e4 doesn't have any meaning, and f3 can be met by rook h2, h1 check with a perpetual check. King e2, rook h2, and white has to keep on repeating moves with a draw. If he tries to play escape with king d3, black can play rook d2, which is a checkmate. So in this position, after king f4, suddenly Gukesh realized that he does not have any win. He played bishop c2, although white is still a pawn up, but black's pieces are too active. The king, knight, and rook, everything is coordinating well, and he can liquidate this position to a dead draw. He played rook d5, which is actually even better than rook h3 because rook d5 threatens white's b pawn. White played rook c4, attacking the pinned knight. Black has to play f5. White played rook b4, placing his rook behind the pawn. And now black played king f3, threatening the f2 pawn. The only way for white to defend the pawn is either he can go bishop e4, but now this rook endgame is drawish because very soon black will pick up the remaining pawns, and he can also go e3 and liquidate all the pawns. Therefore, instead of bishop e4, the only other move which can defend this pawn is bishop d1 check, which Gukesh played. Black played king g2. Well, it's not too late to blunder because here king f4 can be met by f3 winning for white. So king g2 is the only move. White played rook b3. Black played rook e5, threatening discovered check. And here white played f4, attacking the rook. Black played rook e7, retreating as well as supporting his own pawn, a pawn. White played rook e3, unpinning. And black played rook h7. Black went for immediate attack, elimination of pawns. The point to note is that anytime white can't play bishop f3 and bishop e4 because black will then play king f4 and will have an absolute dead draw. Okay, probably white has to play bishop f5, king f5, and white, this is a drawn position. So here after h5, supporting the pawn, black went knight f6 to capture this pawn. White went rook e5. Now, whenever you are defending a pawn down position, you have to look for liquidating or exchanging maximum number of pawns so that for the last pawn, you can even afford to sacrifice your minor piece. Now, after rook e5, black played knight h5, white remained a pawn up, but the knight continued his dangerous dance. It went to g3, rook f8, defending the rook, rook b7, attacking this pawn. So although white is a pawn up, black will eventually capture both the pawns and the game will end in a draw. White played bishop a4, the only way to defend this pawn. And now it's very interesting or instructive the way black finished the game. He played king f3, bringing his king back to the scene of action. He's basically trying to control this pawn. This rook is defending the pawn. The bishop is defending this pawn. White doesn't have many useful moves. He played f5, king attacked the pawn again, f6, knight went to e4 so that black can keep on attacking the pawn. White went bishop c2. Black played a very nice move, that is knight d6. Well, it is not too late to blunder once again. Rook b4 is a blunder because white can play bishop e4, king e4, rook check, followed by f7 and f8. So even here, black has to be careful. He played the only move, that is knight d6. White attacked the knight with his rook, and once again knight b5, which is a very normal move, can face some hurdles. Bishop b3 followed by f7 and f8. So black played the best move once again, king e5, after which white has no way to play for a win. He played bishop b3. Black made again the best move, that is knight f7, blocking the pawn, attacking the rook. White went rook d5 check. Black captured the pawn. Pawns are equal after a long time. And both the players basically knew the game is drawn. So they played the moves to complete their formality. Here, white played bishop c4. Black went rook d6, exchanging the rooks. And after the rooks were exchanged, black played knight d6. And just as I mentioned, he can afford to sacrifice his last minor piece to eliminate the last pawn. So in this position, the game ended in a draw. Well, what can I say about this game? This was the longest game of the match so far, 72 moves with ups and downs. Gukesh will be disappointed not to win from a great position. There were phases when Gukesh outplayed his opponent, but we must give full credit to Ding for saving the game, for finding the series of only moves towards the end of the game. So I think both players played very well, a very entertaining game. We'll meet again tomorrow with the commentary of the 8th game of the World Championship match. I hope the match is heating up and both the players will find form and we'll have a great match, second half of this World Championship match ahead. So goodbye. Thanks for watching.